At the end of the 16th century, in an England torn apart by shifting crowns and bleeding faiths, a nameless woman, neither royal nor noble, stepped quietly into the pages of history. Not with a sword, not with a crown, but with silence. Her weapon was not power. It was not wealth. It was not politics. Her weapon was a rope hidden in a basket, and a decision that would lead to torture, a scaffold, and a death so quiet that history almost forgot to mention it. Her name was Margaret Ward, and they would one day call her the Pearl of Tyburn, not because she was born a lady, but because when death came wrapped in iron and fire, she held her faith tighter than her breath, and walked into martyrdom with nothing but conviction in her hands. This is not fiction. This is not myth. This is not a fairy tale passed through the fog of legend. This happened. And the blood that ran down the wooden beams of Tyburn was real. As real as the screams silenced behind the stone walls of England's most feared prisons. As real as the rope that hung from the hand of a woman who had no title, no protection, and no reason to resist, except that she believed in something no law could take away. Margaret Ward was born around the year 1550 in Cheshire, a quiet stretch of England, still clinging to the rituals and rhythms of the old Catholic faith, even as the royal court demanded otherwise. In the years before her birth, England had already severed its bond with the Pope in Rome. King Henry VIII, drunk with desire and defiance, had torn his kingdom from the Catholic Church so he could remarry his son. Edward VI continued the work, outlawing Catholicism entirely and branding any priest loyal to Rome a traitor to the crown. But that, too, was not the end. For when Edward died young, the throne passed to his sister Mary, a woman raised by a Spanish queen, burning with Catholic fire, who returned the old religion to England with ruthless vengeance. Hundreds were burned. Thousands fled. The land bled on both sides. She became known as Bloody Mary. And then came Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Protestant to her core, brilliant, calculating, relentless. When she took the throne in the year 1558, she issued a religious settlement meant to stabilize the realm. But in reality, it made this deadly. Any priest found saying Mass in secret could be arrested, tortured, and killed. Any citizen who refused to attend the new Protestant services could be fined, imprisoned, or worse. In this world where faith was either a weapon or a noose, Margaret came of age. She moved to London, living in the household of a noble lady, working not as a servant but as a companion, a woman of education, of presence, of intelligence. And it was there that she heard about a Catholic priest being held in Bridewell prison, a name that sent chills down even the toughest spines. Once a palace where King Henry VIII had stayed in his earlier years, Bridewell had since been turned into a prison by his son, Edward. By the time Margaret walked the London streets, it was no longer royal. It was a pit, a place of screams, of blood, of despair. The man held inside was Father Richard Watson. He had been arrested for refusing to renounce his Catholic faith, and under torture crushed, beaten. Broken, he agreed to attend a Protestant service in exchange for release. But when he regained his freedom, he recanted. He spoke out. He reclaimed his beliefs. And he was arrested again. That was when Margaret Ward stepped forward. She began visiting him regularly. She passed through the gates of Bridewell many times, searched every time. She was questioned, watched, doubted but not stopped. Over time, the guards grew complacent. They trusted her. They believed she was only there to comfort a dying man. And so, the searches became lazy, infrequent, predictable. And one day, she hid a rope in her basket. The plan was simple. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Father Watson would climb to the roof of the prison, lower the rope, and escape into the shadows. Margaret would wait below, along with a hired boatman, ready to whisk the priest away before anyone noticed. But the rope doubled in the basket to conceal it was not long enough. When Father Watson dropped from the roof, he fell the remaining height and injured his leg. Blood on the stone, rope still hanging from the window. Evidence left behind in panic. The boatman, terrified at the sight of blood and failure, ran. Margaret was stranded. And yet, instead of fleeing, she found another man, John Roche, who not only helped them escape, but gave Watson his own clothes. Disguising the wounded priest, Watson fled the city, wounded, but alive. But Margaret, whose every visit had been logged, whose rope was still tied to the roof of Bridewell, could not disappear. She was arrested. She was questioned. And when she did not speak, she was tortured. They tied her hands with iron manacles, suspended her from the ceiling. Arms pulled taut above her head until her shoulders threatened to rip free from the sockets. The pain was immediate, unspeakable, relentless. For 8 days, they kept her like that, beaten, scoured, denied even the smallest relief. They asked where Watson had gone. They demanded names. They threatened fire, tearing, death. She said nothing. They dragged her to trial. And before the judge, Margaret Ward stood without shame, without fear, and spoke the words that would echo. Centuries later, I cannot repent for having freed a lamb from the hands of the bloodthirsty wolves. She was offered a final chance to save her life, attend a Protestant service, bow to the Queen, deny her God. She refused, not out of pride, not out of stubbornness, but because, in her own words, her conscience did not allow her to betray her faith. She was found guilty. Of course she was. And on the 30th day of August, in the year 1588, she was marched to Tyburn, alongside John Roche and several priests. Because she was a woman, they spared her the ritual of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. But the rope still found her neck, and the gallows still took her breath. No one wept. No one intervened. And the silence that fell over Tyburn that day was not out of mercy. It was the silence of fear. Margaret Ward, who had never held a sword, never claimed a title, never written a book, died with more courage than all the kings who ruled before her. And though it would take nearly 400 years for Rome to speak her name out loud and declare her a saint, the truth had already been written in the blood-soaked dirt beneath the gallows. A woman, a rope, and a silence that outlived her killers. Long before the name Margaret Ward became a whisper on the scaffold at Tyburn, long before her hands were bound and bloodied, and long before she ever saw the dark stone corridors of Bridewell, she was just a girl in Cheshire, a girl with quiet eyes, perhaps too quiet for her own safety, a girl born not to greatness or poverty, but into a life balanced somewhere between comfort and invisibility, a middle ground that most girls of her time were trained to accept without question. There were no stories written about her birth, no poems composed to predict her future. But somewhere between the soft hills of northern England and the cloistered chapels where the old Catholic Mass was still whispered in secret, something was planted inside her that would not yield when the world demanded surrender. In the year 1550, England was a land of uncertainty dressed in velvet. The air smelled of ink and iron. And the people learned to speak in half-truths. To be Catholic was not yet a death sentence. But it was no longer a comfort either. The country had not yet recovered from the deep fissures left behind by King Henry VIII's rupture with Rome. Under his son, Edward VI, laws had stripped away altars, smashed stained glass, and turned incense into treason. Then came the brief but flaming reign of Mary, who tried to reverse it all with fire. The English people did not breathe easily. They held their breath for decades. Faith became something you learned to bury inside yourself. Like a relic you could not part with, but could never safely display. This was the England into which Margaret opened her eyes, and it would shape every silent step of her life. Cheshire, in those years, was not untouched by the chaos from London, but it still held the rhythms of older England. The priests may have gone into hiding, but the prayers continued. The people were cautious, but not yet broken. It was a place where a girl could be raised with both fear and devotion braided tightly together. No one remembers her mother's face or her father's voice. There are no surviving letters, no diaries, no portraits. And yet we know this much. The child they raised would one day choose pain over silence, and death over betrayal, not for love, not for family, not even for herself, but for a priest she had no duty to, and a God she could not see. It is not clear exactly when Margaret left Cheshire. Perhaps she was sent away for service, as many young women were. Perhaps she sought something more than green fields and whispered prayers. But by the time she arrived in London, she was no longer a child, and the world she entered was no longer kind. The capital, by then, was under the firm grip of Elizabeth I, glorious to her admirers, merciless to her enemies, and coldly pragmatic to all. It was the year 1578. The fires of Mary's purges had faded, but they had been replaced not by peace, but by the silence of fear. Elizabeth, in her wisdom or her cunning, understood that martyrs made legends. So rather than burn her enemies, she chose to starve them, hang them, or grind them down behind walls where no one could hear the screams. That was how Bridewell came to be what it was. A palace turned into a prison, a house once filled with music and silk, now echoing with chains and the low moans of men who had knelt at the wrong altar. It was into this world that Margaret stepped away, working in the household of a distinguished lady, someone close enough to court to afford fine dresses, but not so high as to draw constant scrutiny. This placement would prove to be both her protection and her downfall. She was not a scullery maid, nor a mere servant. She was a companion, which meant she could read, she could write, and more dangerously she could think. It is perhaps no coincidence that such women were the most feared by authorities. Men with swords were easy to spot, but women with silence and patience, those were the ones who could pass through walls unnoticed and carry truth like a dagger beneath a gown. Somehow, through this household, Margaret came to know of Father Richard Watson, a Catholic priest, imprisoned for his refusal to renounce his beliefs, and held at Bridewell, a prison that had once hosted royalty, and now fed upon rebels of the soul. She did not know him before. She had no blood ties to him. And yet, something about his story pulled at her. Perhaps it was the quiet outrage of a girl who had spent her life listening to hymns in secret. Perhaps it was the recognition of a man trying to remain whole in a country that demanded everyone break. Or perhaps it was simply that Margaret could not look away from suffering. Not then. Not ever. Bridewell was not a place people entered willingly. The walls were thick with rot. The cells held men who had forgotten the sound of their own names. And yet Margaret entered. She visited Father Watson under the guise of comfort, bringing nothing more dangerous than bread, a kind word, and a silence that could not be purchased. At first, the guards watched her. She was searched. Her name was written, but she came back. Again, and again, and again, and slowly, the men with the keys began to forget how dangerous faith could be when carried in a woman's smile. No one knows how long it took for her to earn their trust. Weeks, months, but in time, the searches grew lazy. The questions stopped, and Margaret began to carry more than bread. In her basket, she concealed a rope, folded neatly, hidden among linen, and with it, a plan that would either free a priest or destroy everything she had built. The escape was planned for a night when the moon was thin and the air still. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Father Watson would climb to the rooftop, drop the rope, and lower himself down into the waiting arms of Margaret and a boatman who had been bribed for silence. But like all plans made under persecution, this one was fragile. The rope, folded in half to fit the basket, had not been measured carefully. When the priest dropped, he fell harder than expected. The rope ended too soon. His body struck the ground. He groaned. He bled. And in that moment of chaos, someone made the most human of all mistakes. They forgot the rope, still tied to the prison window, still dangling in plain sight, still whispering treason into the morning air. The boatman saw the blood, saw the failure, and fled. Margaret did not. She found another man, John Roach, who gave Father Watson his clothes and helped him limp away into the night. But the damage had been done. The guards found the rope. They remembered the woman who had visited so often. They retraced the names in the registry. And when Margaret tried to return to her home, they were already waiting. She was arrested without struggle, and though no knife was found in her hand, and no oath had passed her lips, the charge was clear. She had helped a traitor. She had aided an enemy of the Queen. She had dared, as a woman, to act on behalf of something higher than the crown. And for that, she would be made an example. What followed was not yet the trial. That would come later. First, they broke her body. They used the manacles, a device of English ingenuity, designed not to kill, but to ruin. Her wrists were bound above her head, suspended from the ceiling, so that her toes barely touched the floor. Her weight became her punishment, her silence, her crime. And as the hours became days, and the days became something worse, she said nothing. She did not beg. She did not curse. She endured. 8 days. That was how long they kept her hanging between breath and bone. And still, when they finally dragged her to court bleeding, exhausted, crushed in spirit but not in soul, she stood tall and spoke the words that history would remember longer than any law. I cannot repent for having freed a lamb from the hands of the bloodthirsty wolves. And from that moment, it was no longer a question of whether she would die. Only when. There are men in history whose names are etched into marble, recorded in gold leaf on cathedral ceilings, spoken in mass with reverence, it remembered for miracles or sermons or victory. Father Richard Watson is not one of those men. His name is not carved into plaques, nor sung by choirs. There are no shrines in his honor, no chapels bearing his crest. And yet he was the reason a woman swung from a rope at Tyburn, the reason someone brought a rope hidden in linen, the reason someone chose silence even as her wrists were torn open by chains. He was not a saint. He was not a soldier. He was not even particularly brave, but he was broken. And for that, he became holy in the eyes of one woman and in her quiet devotion. He found the one thing the state could not rip from him, the dignity of being loved in silence. When Margaret first laid eyes on Father Watson, he was no longer a man of strength or power. He had already been arrested once before. He had already been tortured. He had already given in. And in the England of Queen Elizabeth I, where faith was currency and betrayal was often the only way to survive, Father Watson had made the choice that so many others had made before him to save his skin. To kneel in the wrong church, to whisper prayers he did not believe, and to walk free as a man ashamed. They had broken him, not with fire, but with the threat of it. And for a moment, he let go. But once outside those walls, breathing the London air again, walking past churches that no longer carried the bells of his youth, Watson did what the authorities feared most. He changed his mind. He refused to go quietly. He refused to remain in safety. He stood in public, trembling but resolute, and declared that his soul could not live in a lie. He repented, his repentance. And for that, they came for him again. This time, they locked him in Bridewell, the palace turned prison where walls still remembered royalty, but now wept with suffering. He was beaten again, his limbs stretched, his fingernails bloodied, his body tossed into darkness. But now, the second time, the state would not be so forgiving. They knew that broken men could still speak, and a priest who spoke the wrong words could spark a fire that even Elizabeth's laws could not put out. And then Margaret came. She came not as a lover, not as kin, not as one of the many devout women who followed priests in secret. She came as something rarer, an equal in spirit, if not in power. She asked no favors. She offered no tears. She simply listened, visit after visit. She stood by the cell, offering words, gestures, silence. And in that silence, something between them grew. Not romance, not obsession, but a kind of holy defiance that made every exchange between them more dangerous than the last. They spoke of liturgies outlawed, of saints now declared traitors, of a church exiled from the kingdom. But more than that, they spoke of endurance, of what it meant to stay human in a world that asked you to be silent or damned. Margaret did not ask Watson to be brave again. She did not demand his courage. She simply saw him as someone still worth saving, even if the law called him a criminal, and his own soul still bore the bruise of shame. And Watson, for his part, did not ask her to help him. He did not plan the escape. He did not conspire. He merely allowed it when it was offered. Perhaps that is the most human detail in this story. The fact that the man for whom Margaret would be tortured never asked her to sacrifice herself. He simply accepted the rope. He climbed the wall. He fled when he could. And then he disappeared. No one knows what became of him. There are no records of his final hiding place. No diary entries or trial transcripts. The man who had once been broken, once been jailed, once fallen from grace, and then tried to rise again, vanished into the fog of history, carried perhaps to another safe house, another country, another name, and for centuries, it has been Margaret's name that remains, her story, her trial, her suffering, but never his. And yet, when the ropes pulled her wrists upward and the pain howled through her bones, it was his name they asked for. When the questions came, sharp and cruel, it was his location they demanded. And she, who could have spared herself, who could have traded his hiding place for breath and water and warmth, said nothing. Not once. The torturers were not amateurs. They had learned from decades of suppressing rebellion. They did not waste time with kindness. They used iron cuffs and gravity. The manacles suspended her from the ceiling. Her arms pulled above her head. Her feet barely touching the ground. Her blood pooling where her strength once lived. Every heartbeat was a scream. Every second an invitation to give in. But Margaret never did. For 8 days, they kept her in that state body trembling, bones grinding, skin torn. They offered food in exchange for words. They offered freedom in exchange for betrayal. But she had already made her choice, long before the rope ever touched her hands. The moment she stepped into that prison, she knew what it would cost. And she had made peace with it. Because Father Watson was not just a man. He was the embodiment of everything. England had lost faith in exile. Truth behind bars. Conscience, punished for refusing to bend. They called her mad. They called her dangerous. But what frightened them most was that she was calm. Her silence was not the silence of fear, but the silence of someone who had nothing left to be threatened with. And when they finally dragged her before the court, her body half ruined, her clothes stained, her wrists still raw, she did not waver. When asked if she regretted freeing a known traitor, she looked into the eyes of her accusers and said, "I cannot repent for having freed a lamb from the hands of the bloodthirsty wolves." And that was when they understood. She had not been trying to save a man. She had been trying to save a soul. Perhaps his. Perhaps her own. Perhaps England's. Though it was far too late. The trial was a formality. The sentence, a certainty. But they still asked her, one last time, to save herself. Just one service at the new church. Just one prayer said in the Queen's name. One nod to the system that had chained her. And they would let her live. But she refused. Not out of pride. Not out of vanity. But because she believed the truth should not be whispered in fear. She believed silence, held long enough, could be holy. They gave her a day. One day between sentence and death. One day to prepare herself. To write. To weep. To beg. But she did none of those things. She spent the night not praying for rescue, but praying for those who had tortured her. She asked God to forgive the men who built the rope that would soon find her neck. She forgave Father Watson for surviving. She forgave John Roche for helping what? She forgave England for not remembering. And then the morning came. The crowd gathered. The scaffold was raised. Her name was read aloud, not as a martyr, not as a saint, not even as a criminal, but as a warning to all women who dared to act as if they too had souls that could not be silenced. And through it all, she held his name. Never once did she reveal where he went. Never once did she abandon the man who had once abandoned himself. Never once did she let their fear become hers. She held his name, even when the rope took hers away. The rope was folded in half, coiled beneath a layer of cloth and bread, tucked into the bottom of a basket lined with patience and prayer. It had not been measured with precision. There had been no time, no quiet place, no long table in which to stretch it out from end to end. It had been chosen in urgency, cut in darkness, folded in faith, and carried through the gates of Bridewell, beneath the eyes of guards who had grown too comfortable with her comings and goings. The guards had once searched her thoroughly, fingered every seam of her bodice. Pride beneath the basket's linen, but familiarity is the lullaby of negligence. And Margaret, with her modest dress and gentle hands, had become familiar, and so they stopped searching her properly, and so the rope made it through. It was not Margaret's first visit. By then, she had already become part of the stone rhythm of the prison. She would come. She would speak softly to the priest. She would leave. Again. And again. Until they forgot that women had ever been dangerous. Until they forgot that baskets could carry treason. Until they forgot that one faithful heart could do more harm to the crown than 1,000 printed pamphlets. And so on that night, when the moon hung low like a suspended verdict, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and anticipation, she stood below the prison wall, holding her breath and waiting for the man she had come to save. The priest had waited. Too. He had kept the rope hidden inside his cell, or as close to hidden as stone and straw would allow. He had waited for the night when the guards drank a little too deeply, or when the sky turned black enough to hide a man's descent. And when it came, when the hour grew still, and Margaret signaled from the shadows, he climbed. He climbed as quietly as a broken man could, his body still aching from the last round of beatings, his legs less sure than they had once been, his fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the long absence of hope. And then he reached the top. Below him, the street was silent. Margaret stood with a boatman, an unnamed man who had agreed to help for money. Perhaps, or out of pity. The river lay nearby, dark and slow, ready to carry them to another street, another name, another beginning. All that was needed was the descent, but the rope, God help them, was too short. It was a small mistake. A single miscalculation. The kind of error that would have made little difference on any other night, in any other story. But this rope, this length of coarse hope, had been folded in half to fit in the basket, and in the panic, no one had remembered to measure the height from rooftop to alley. It was short, not by much, but just enough. Father Watson looked down, then looked again. Then, with the kind of desperate trust that only the damned can muster, he lowered himself over the ledge and clung to the rope until the last coil slid through his fingers and he dropped. It was not a fall from the heavens. It was not a fall meant to kill, but it was far enough to twist the leg, to break the ankle, to send pain blooming through every sinew. He landed hard. Too hard. The sound echoed through the alley. A sharp grunt of pain followed, and somewhere above them, behind a barred window, someone stirred. Margaret rushed to his side. He was alive, but wounded. The priest could not walk on his own. The plan had unraveled in seconds. And then came the second mistake, perhaps the worst of all. They left the rope behind, still knotted to the stone, still hanging from the rooftop, still swaying in the air like a flag of treason. A silent admission that someone had tried, that someone had helped, that the prison had been breached. The boatman saw the blood, the injury, the limp, the danger, and in that most human of reactions, he chose fear. He ran. He left Margaret and the priest behind, stranded in the very street where salvation had been planned. There was no time to shout after him. No use in rage. Fear does not reason. It flees. So, Margaret, still panting from the shock of the fall, I did what she had always done. She adapted. She found another man. No one knows where she met him. Perhaps he was waiting nearby as a backup. Perhaps he was a stranger she begged in the street. But his name was John Roche. And he agreed to help. He brought a second boat. He gave the priest his own clothes. They changed garments there in the darkness. One man helping another to disappear. And then Watson was gone disguised. Limping. Anonymous. A ghost before morning. Margaret returned home. She might have thought she was safe. She might have prayed that the priest had made it far enough. She might have dared to hope that the silence of night would buy them time. But the rope, left swaying from the roof, was louder than any confession. It took only hours for the guards to notice a flurry of feet, a shaken captain, a report written in haste. There had been an escape attempt, and only one visitor had seen the prisoner in the days leading up to it. Only one person, who came often enough to be trusted. Only one name appeared again and again in the prison register. They came for her the next day. Margaret did not resist. There was nothing left to resist. She was taken from her home, her skirts still damp from the night's fog, her hands still carrying the warmth of rope. They asked her questions. She said nothing. They offered leniency in exchange for a name. She said nothing. They showed her the rope coarse, stained, still warm from use. She did not flinch. And so they tortured her. The manacles again. The iron cuffs. Suspended from the ceiling. Not for hours. For days. 8 days. To be exact, 8 days of silence. Of bone grinding against bone. Of joints screaming in agony. 8 days of asking the same question. Where did he go? Who helped him? What name did he take? And for 8 days, she said nothing, because the rope had been too short. And that mistake could not be undone, because the boatman had fled, and he could not be brought back, because John Roche had helped, and he too would pay the price. But mostly because she knew that in a world where priests were hunted, it was not just a man's body that needed to be protected. It was his name, his presence, his possibility. If Margaret had spoken, she might have spared herself the noose. She might have earned a quieter death. A cell, a slow wasting. Even exile. Perhaps. But she had not endured that night. That fear. That mistake. Only to throw it all away with a name. And so, the rope that had fallen too short became more than a rope. It became a symbol, a testament, a final act of rebellion. And in leaving it behind, Margaret had left behind the truth, but not the confession, because she never gave them that. It was not really a trial. Not in the way that justice imagines itself. Not in the way the stories speak of measured judges and carefully weighed truths. Of defense and evidence, and the noble silence of impartial law. It was a theater with blood for its curtain, and power for its script. Margaret Ward stood at the center of that stage, not as a defendant, not even as a rebel, but as a warning one written in flesh, designed to echo through parishes and parliaments and whisper through the mouths of mothers who would teach their daughters not to walk too far into faith. Her verdict had been decided long before she entered the room, long before the manacles were unlocked, long before her trembling legs were forced to stand upright in front of the crown's appointed men. This was not a search for truth. It was a performance meant to teach silence. The chamber was not grand. The trial did not take place in a vaulted hall of majesty and oak, as some might imagine. No light streamed through colored glass. No choir murmured sacred notes. It was a plain room, cold and narrow, where power dripped not from ceremony, but from certainty. The certainty that a woman had crossed the line, had acted without permission, had believed that compassion could be higher than obedience. She was brought in with wrists still raw, shoulders sagging from 8 days of suspension. They did not let her rest. They did not even let her change her clothes. She wore the same fabric that had soaked in sweat and blood, now stiffened into dark patches of dried defiance. She did not speak unless spoken to, but when spoken to, she did not beg. That, more than anything, seemed to trouble them. They asked her why she had aided a known criminal, why she had risked not only her own life, but the order of the realm, why she had hidden rope in a basket, spoken softly in a traitor's ear, and stood beneath a prison window, as if she had every right to rewrite the crown's decree. She said only that she had saved a soul, that she could not do otherwise, that the voice in her conscience was louder than the Queen's laws, and older, and closer to God. They called her proud. They called her stubborn. But in truth, she was not proud, and her stubbornness was not vanity, but something more dangerous: clarity. She saw the system for what it was. She saw that no word she offered would change the outcome. That mercy was not a seed that grew in such places, that her judges had already rehearsed the sentence they would read, and only needed her presence to make it official. They offered her a final way out. The same bait the crown dangled before so many others. Attend one Protestant service. Just one. Speak one word of loyalty. Cross yourself in the wrong direction. And they would spare you, not because they wanted to, but because a tamed heretic was more useful than a dead one. A converted Catholic was proof that the state was winning, that the old faith was rotting quietly, that the Queen's will could reach even into the hearts of women. But Margaret did not move. She did not nod. She did not tremble. She said, in a voice no louder than a prayer, "My conscience does not permit me to betray my faith. I would rather die than deny God." And so, they sentenced her. They read it aloud, as if the room had not already been soaked in that decision, as if the words meant something new, as if anyone needed reminding that the rope had been prepared long before the trial began. She was to be hanged. No drawing, no quartering. That courtesy, if it could be called such, was due only to her sex. Men were made into public lessons. Women were simply made to disappear. They gave her 1 day, 24 hours between the sentence and the gallows. It was meant to be enough time for reflection, for regret, for the breaking of spirit. A window, they hoped, in which she might finally choose survival over sanctity. They placed her in a cell, small and without window. The kind of place where silence is not peace, but punishment. They gave her ink, in case she wanted to write. They gave her food, in case she chose to eat. They gave her a priest, though not of her faith, in case she chose to confess. She did none of those things. She fasted. She prayed. She forgave. She did not ask for the Queen's mercy. She did not send letters to plead with nobility. She did not curse the men who had condemned her. She forgave the judge. She forgave the guards. She forgave the rope. And most of all, she forgave the priest who had escaped, and who would never see her again. Because that, perhaps more than anything else, was what no one could understand: how a woman could accept such pain for a man who had already vanished, a man who had been weak, a man who had once betrayed his faith before reclaiming it, a man who, by all accounts, had done nothing to earn the life she was giving up. But Margaret did not see it that way. She did not weigh him on the scales of worthiness. She saw only that he was hunted, and that she could help, and that to refuse him would have been a sin far greater than to die. The morning of her execution came quietly. No trumpet sounded. No crowd cheered, but the people gathered all the same. They always did. Tyburn was not a secret. The gallows were well known. People brought children. Merchants closed shops. Women stood in silence while men whispered rumors. The condemned were paraded through the streets. Not quickly, but slowly, deliberately, so that every eye could see what disobedience looked like in the flesh. Margaret walked the road without stumbling. Beside her was John Roche, the man who had given his clothes to the priest. He too had been caught. He too had refused to betray the others. He too was sentenced to die. They did not speak much during that final walk. There is no record of their conversation. No witness testimony. But it is easy to imagine the quiet between them, not of fear, but of resolve. A kind of sacred calm that settles on those who have already made peace with what comes next. When they reached the scaffold, Margaret was offered one last opportunity. A final, whispered plea from a guard. Attend the service. He may have said, just bow your head. Just once. She shook her head. And then she stepped forward. She did not cry. She did not curse. She did not look back. And when the rope was placed around her neck, and the crowd fell into that terrible silence that only ever comes, before a body falls, she closed her eyes and mouthed a prayer not for herself, but for the England that had forgotten how to weep for its own children. And then she was gone. The scaffold at Tyburn was not made for mourning. It was not a place for prayer, though sometimes the condemned whispered them. It was not a place for justice, though the authorities claimed it as such. It was not even a place for silence, though silence, like the gallows itself, always arrived in the end. Tyburn was built for theater. It was built to be watched. It was built so that those who gathered mothers, merchants, guards, grooms, boys too young to understand, but old enough to remember, could stand close enough to see the trembling knees of the accused, to hear the last words they were allowed to speak, and to witness the moment the body fell and the soul, if it still clung, was flung into the judgment of eternity. And so when Margaret Ward climbed those final steps, she did not climb into anonymity. She climbed into the gaze of a kingdom. It was the 30th day of August. In the year 1588, the sky that morning was gray and wide and mercilessly still. There was no wind, no rain, no sun, nothing to hide in, nothing to hold, just the unblinking eye of heaven and the stifled breath of a city that had learned to feign indifference even when it quivered. The gallows at Tyburn stood in its familiar place, the wooden frame stark against the sky, the ropes swinging gently in anticipation of what all present knew must come. There had already been deaths there. Dozens. Hundreds. It was the same gallows that had taken traitors and thieves and mothers and monks. The same structure. The same hangman. The same rope. Used and reused until it was polished by sorrow and stained by repetition. But that morning, something was different. Margaret Ward did not look like the others. She was not bruised from street brawls. She was not wild-eyed or dirty or loud. She was not dragged kicking. She was not screaming. Her feet touched the wood as if she had walked there on her own accord, as if she had climbed a hill to look out at the world one last time. She was calm not because she did not fear death, but because she had already died. In part, long before, on the 8th day of torture, on the night the priest fell, on the morning she stood before her judges. Whatever could be broken in her had already been shattered and remade into something that no rope could sever. John Roche walked beside her, the man who had offered his coat, his name, his silence, the man who had watched the escape collapse and had stepped in without hesitation. He was not a priest. He was not noble. He was not trained in anything except loyalty. But that was enough to condemn him. And now he stood as her only companion in death. They did not speak much as the crowd gathered, but their presence beside each other, unashamed, resolute, said everything that needed saying. Around them, the crowd swelled. People came not because they hated Margaret Ward, but because they had been trained to watch. Executions had become public rites, a kind of inverted communion, where the body was not blessed, but broken, Parents brought children to teach them what happened to those who disobeyed. Street vendors sold bread and drink, while the condemned stood above them, trembling or praying or vomiting with fear. And yet, on that morning, as Margaret stepped forward, something peculiar settled over the crowd. No one shouted. No one laughed. There were murmurs. Of course, whispers. A low rustle of bodies. But not the jeering that often came when traitors met their end. Because deep down, they knew, or at least, some did, that this woman had not killed, had not plotted, had not stolen. She had simply acted with love, and that, perhaps, was more threatening than any blade. She had chosen faith over safety, mercy over law, compassion over caution, and the gallows, for all its wooden certainty, had no argument against that. The executioner did not look her in the eyes. Perhaps he had hanged too many. Perhaps he had once believed in something himself. Or perhaps he simply understood that what he was about to do would be remembered not for the act, but for the silence that followed. There was no priest to hear her confession. Not of her choosing. At least, the state had forbidden Catholic priests to attend executions of their own flock. They feared that final absolutions whispered at the foot of the gallows might rob the rope of its moral weight. But Margaret needed no witness. Her soul had already spoken. Her trial had been her confession. Her silence, under torture, had been her vow. And so, when the hangman adjusted the knot, she simply looked forward, not to the crowd, not to the sky, but to a point just beyond the gallows, as though something waited for her there. Not salvation, not certainty, but something. And then the rope came down. There was no shout, no gasp. The trap released. Her body fell. The silence that followed was not one of respect, but of helplessness. The people did not know how to weep for a woman like this. She did not fit into the stories they were told. She was neither monster nor martyr in their eyes. She was something else, something frightening. Proof that a woman could choose death, not out of desperation, but out of principle. John Roche followed soon after. The hangman did not pause. The second rope, already prepared, already measured, already destined to match the first, tightened around the man who had chosen silence over safety. And when it was done, when both bodies hung still, the crowd remained as if waiting for something else. A word, a cry, a voice from heaven. But none came. The gallows gave no shadow. The sky remained unbroken. And the people, one by one, walked away. But not all of them forgot. In years to come, a few would speak of that day not with outrage, but with unease. Something had shifted. Something had been revealed. That the crown could not simply kill faith. That execution was not always erasure. That silence, held long enough, could echo louder than any sermon. And though Margaret was buried without fanfare, without stone, without liturgy, her name remained, passed quietly from mouth to mouth, written in secret books, remembered by those who still dared to kneel before altars hidden beneath floorboards. The crown had hoped to make an example of her, and in a way, and it did, but not in the way it intended, because even as her body swung in the gray morning air, unclaimed and unnamed by the church she died for, the people watching understood, even if they did not yet say it aloud, that they had just witnessed something they could not unsee. A woman who had no sword, no rank, no protector. A woman who had no army but a conscience. A woman who climbed the scaffold, not with hatred, not with fear, but with love. And in that moment, before the crowd blinked, Before the hangman looked away, before the world swallowed the morning, they saw her, truly saw her. And that, in the end, was what could not be hanged. After a death like Margaret's, the world does not end. It does not shatter or erupt or hold its breath in reverence. Instead, it carries on, as if nothing has happened. The hangman walks home with stained hands and an empty coin pouch. The crowd returns to their shops and chimneys and silent breakfasts. The rope is cut, the scaffold cleaned, the body is buried. Not with hymns, but with haste. Earth flung over a name that the state has tried to erase. But there is always a moment quiet, lingering, unnoticed, when someone, somewhere, remembers. Not loudly, not with banners, but with a question that will not leave them. A word that remains unspoken in the mouth. A letter that is never sent. In the weeks that followed Margaret Ward's execution, London tried, as it always did, to forget. The authorities spoke little of her. Her name was removed from records where it could be. The rope she had smuggled into Bridewell was burned, or buried, or left to rot. The other prisoners were warned. The guards were disciplined quietly for their lapse. And Father Watson, wherever he was, if he was even still alive, remained unseen, unheard, unnamed. He had vanished like a dream at sunrise, leaving behind only pain and a silence too heavy to carry. But not everyone forgot. Some, it is said, wrote letters. Letters to the Queen, to the Privy Council, to the bishops who had stood silent. Some wrote asking for her body to be returned, that she might be buried in hallowed ground. Others asked for explanation why a woman who had killed no one, stolen nothing, harmed no soul, had been executed like a criminal. The letters were signed with trembling hands, sometimes without names, and they were written not in rage, but in confusion, as if asking, surely this is not who we are. Surely this is not what we meant when we said justice. None of those letters were answered. They were read. Of that we may be certain. Someone held them in their hands. Someone frowned. Someone passed them along, folded them shut, filed them somewhere beneath documents of state security and public order. But no replies were sent. To reply would be to acknowledge. To acknowledge would be to confess, and confession, in the court of Elizabethan England, was reserved for the scaffold. And so, the people waited. They waited for the church to speak, not the old church, that battered remnant of Rome, driven underground, clinging to its Latin Mass and whispered rites, but the new church, the official one, the polished one. The church that had watched a woman hang and said nothing, but the church did not answer. Its doors remained locked to Margaret in death, just as they had been in life. No bell was rung for her, no psalm sung, no candle lit. The new bishops did not mention her name in sermons. No prayer was offered for her soul, because to speak of her would be to admit she had a soul worth mourning. And if she had a soul, then the rope that choked her had touched something sacred, and no one wished to look that closely at what they had done. And so she was buried without stone, without cross, without priest. There is no record of the grave, no place a pilgrim might kneel. The earth swallowed her name as the crown had swallowed her voice. And yet, beneath that silence, something stirred. In small houses, behind shuttered windows, the faithful gathered. Women lit candles in secret, their flames hidden behind pots and cloth. Men passed her name quietly from mouth to mouth, as though it were fragile and flammable and holy. And in those dark corners, something unexpected happened. Margaret Ward became not a symbol of failure, but of fidelity, not of rebellion, but of resolve, not of victory, but of the kind of loss that cannot be forgotten. The Catholics who survived her understood what the crown did not. That martyrdom was not made on the gallows. It was made in the refusal, in the quiet resistance, in the silence that followed the question, "Where is he?" and the answer that never came. Margaret had not preached. She had not fought. She had simply said no, and for that, she had been hung. And that no, held long enough, had become a kind of prayer. It was years later, decades. In fact, before her name returned to public light, and even then, it did not arrive with trumpets or fanfare. It arrived in ink, on lists of martyrs compiled by men who remembered what the church had once been, and what it had once asked of its children. Her story, copied and recopied, smuggled from hand to hand, became part of a tapestry of quiet suffering, of those who had died not with swords, but with steadfastness. And when finally, Century la Terre, the Vatican opened its books and began to count its dead, Margaret's name was there. She was canonized in the year 1970 by Pope Paul VI. 4 centuries after the noose had snapped her voice in two. But even then, even with Rome's seal of sanctity, the world around her had changed too much to remember what it had lost. And yet her silence endures, because there are still churches that lock their doors to the inconvenient, still systems that forget the weight of mercy, still courts that pretend a verdict is the same as truth, and still women who walk without witness, carrying rope in baskets woven from conviction. Margaret's voice does not echo from pulpits or ring from bells. It lingers in the places where letters go unanswered. It waits in the corners of rooms where the church grows quiet when it ought to speak. It stands in the shadow of every gallows built not to punish crime, but to erase conscience. And in that silence, Margaret Ward still breathes. There are some memories that refuse to die. No matter how many ropes are knotted, or how many fires are lit to consume them, they live not in monuments or marble, but in breath, in the hushed murmur of a name, in the flicker of a candle's flame that will not go out, even when the wind insists it should. Margaret Ward's memory was one of those that would not burn. England tried to forget her, and for a long time, it succeeded. The city that had watched her die built new streets, raised new walls, crowned new monarchs. The square at Tyburn became a crossing of carriages and trade, its gallows dismantled, its soil paved over, as though paving could erase what the ground had tasted. But somewhere beneath the cobblestones, her name remained, not carved, not marked, but present, like a ghost that does not haunt so much as hum. For nearly 4 centuries, she was a silence passed down through whispers, a story told behind locked doors and veiled curtains. The old faith went underground, and with it went the memory of those who had been executed for keeping it alive. The state called them traitors, the faithful called them witnesses. The government erased their names from the rolls of honor. The priests scribbled them again in the margins of missals. Margaret's name was not the loudest, not the most famous, not even the most tragic. Others had suffered longer, some more gruesomely. Yet something about her lingered. Perhaps it was because she had been a woman with no office, no vow, no mission except mercy. Perhaps because her act had been so small, just a rope, a visit, a moment of courage, and yet it had cost her everything. Or perhaps because her death had not asked to be remembered. And it was precisely that quietness that made it unforgettable. The centuries rolled forward like waves against stone. England changed crowns, changed faiths, changed enemies. Civil war came and went. Thrones rose and crumbled, and the world that had once hung Margaret Ward became unrecognizable. Yet in the corners of Catholic households, her name was still murmured in prayer. Mothers told their daughters of the woman who had hidden a rope in a basket. Fathers whispered her story beside candlelight before blowing it out. The memory survived, carried not by historians, but by the humble, the kind of people who do not write history, but who keep it alive when history stops caring. And through them, Margaret's silence was transformed from tragedy into testament. When Rome began to look back upon the blood that had soaked England's soil, it found hundreds, men and women, priests and layfolk, rich and poor, who had died for the same unyielding faith. They called them the 40 martyrs of England and Wales. Though the number was never precise, some were beheaded, some hanged, some torn apart. Their names had been spoken only in secret for generations. But the Church, centurilateur, began to reclaim them, one by one, like lost children brought home after a long exile. Among them was Margaret Ward, the woman whose silence had outlived the empire that condemned her. It was the year 1970, when the Vatican, under Pope Paul VI, declared her a saint. Nearly 400 years after the gallows had taken her breath, her name was spoken again, in the open, not as a warning, but as a benediction. It was said in churches, sung in hymns, written on parchment, not by judges, but by priests. Her feast day was fixed on the 30th of August, the day of her death. The day the rope had tightened around her neck became the day her name was reborn. But canonization is not resurrection. Rome may have granted her sanctity, but the earth that covered her bones remained unmoved. Her grave, if it still existed, lay unmarked and unknown. There were no relics, no fragments of cloth, no strands of hair preserved in glass. The crown had made sure of that. They had buried her anonymously so that no pilgrim might kneel. No child might learn to whisper her name. And yet, in a strange way, that absence became part of her sanctity. For the church had built many shrines of stone, but Margaret Ward's shrine was made of memory, and memory cannot be outlawed. Still, one cannot help but feel the weight of irony in it all. The feast came too late. The recognition, though righteous, came centuries after her silence had faded into dust. The prayers that should have been said above her grave were spoken in marble basilicas, an ocean away. The kingdom that had killed her now sent polite envoys to Rome to nod respectfully, while her name was read among the canonized. The bells that tolled in her honor rang in churches that had once condemned her as a traitor. The world had turned so many times that even repentance had become ceremony. And yet, perhaps that is how truth survives, not through justice, but through endurance. Margaret Ward did not need the applause of history. Her victory was already sealed, in the night she refused to speak, in the day she refused to kneel. In the moment, her rope fell too short, yet still reached heaven. The world could take her life, but not her choice. And so, while the ink of her sainthood was still drying in Rome, the quiet persistence of her story continued to reach the hearts of those who found themselves standing where she once stood, at the crossroads between conscience and law, between silence and surrender. In the English countryside, where the ruins of old monasteries still breathed the ghost of forgotten prayers, there were those who claimed that on late summer evenings, near the day of her feast, when the sun bled red across the sky, the air seemed to hold a kind of stillness, as if waiting for something. Some said it was the echo of her breath. Some said it was the sound of the rope creaking one last time. Others said it was only the wind, but for those who remembered, it was Margaret, reminding the living that some faiths cannot be buried, that some fires cannot be quenched, and that memory itself can be a form of resurrection. The church. Of course, we did what churches do. It celebrated. It recorded. It proclaimed. But outside the sanctuaries, among the people whose ancestors had watched her die, there was a quieter remembrance, not of miracle, but of humanity, not of sainthood, but of endurance. For Margaret Ward's story was never one of triumph. It was one of steadfastness. She did not conquer. She endured. She did not win. She remained. And that, in the end, was enough. The feast came too late for her, but not for those who needed her example. In every generation, there would be those who found themselves pressed between obedience and conscience, between what was demanded and what was right. And for them, Margaret Ward's silence would speak again. It would whisper through locked churches and empty courts and quiet prisons, saying, "Hold fast," saying, "There is strength in the stillness before surrender," saying, "The rope is short, but heaven is closer than you think." And so, though centuries have turned, and the world has changed, the memory of Margaret Ward, this woman who was neither queen nor soldier nor saint in her own time, remains as sharp and alive as the day she stood on the scaffold. The rope may have taken her life, but not her voice. It lives in the breath between prayers. It lingers in the silence after confession. It hums beneath the chants of those who still believe that truth, even when choked, finds its way to light. The feast came too late. Yes, but perhaps it was never meant for her. Perhaps it was meant for us. There is a quiet that falls over the world in the hour before sleep. A stillness that is neither fear nor peace, but something else, something older, like a memory stirring in the dark. It is in that hour, when the noise has faded and the shadows take their proper shape, that the mind finally allows itself to feel what the day kept at bay. And in that soft hour, when the heart listens more than it speaks, the name Margaret Ward still returns, like the last candle flickering before it goes out, not asking to be remembered, only refusing to be forgotten. She died without a tomb. No stone bears her face. No churchyard holds her bones. The place where she fell into death was swept clean. Its wood repurposed. Its earth paved over. Its silence left behind as a warning to others. For centuries, she was not laid to rest, only laid aside. And yet even now, long after the gallows that hanged her has vanished into memory, her name has not disappeared. It lingers not loudly, not triumphantly, but with the same strength she carried in her silence. The kind that bends without breaking and chooses faith, not because it is safe, but because it is true. What do we do with stories like hers? In a world so far removed from hers, what meaning can be drawn from a rope that fell too short? From a body that was left to hang in a place where bread was sold the next morning as though nothing had happened? It would be easier to forget, easier to let her vanish back into dust, into the shadowed footnotes of old state trials and yellowed records, but there is something in her story soft, painful, steady, that refuses to die, perhaps because we recognize something of ourselves in her, not the martyrdom. Perhaps we who are safe in our homes, who will never face scaffold or chain for what we believe, but the quiet choices we make when no one is watching, the moment we choose to keep silent for the right reason, the moment we refuse to betray what we know is good, the moment we say no, not out of defiance, but out of love, Margaret did not D to make a point. She did not D to win. She did not ask for sainthood or songs. She simply did not yield. When offered the rope or the lie, she chose the rope, not because she welcomed death, but because she would not trade her soul for a life that wasn't truly hers. And so she stood, worn and wounded, in front of a crowd that would not weep for her. And she gave her breath back to the world without bitterness. In the end, it is not the gallows that define her. It is not the manacles, not the silence of the church, not the locked door or the burned rope. It is the soft persistence of her memory. The rope broke her body, but not her voice. And now that voice lives in places no state can reach. It lives in the pause before a choice is made. It lives in the breath before a truth is spoken. It lives in the candles lit in quiet corners for reasons not explained. It lives in every whispered prayer for courage. She was canonized centuries later, her name placed among 40 martyrs. Printed in books. Read aloud in Mass. But long before Rome spoke her name aloud, the people had already been carrying it. Women had named daughters after her. Men had remembered her in prayer. Children had heard the story of the girl from Cheshire who once hid a rope in a basket and changed the shape of silence. Rome only confirmed what the faithful already knew, that the world had tried to bury Margaret Ward. And failed. She was not rich. She was not royal. She was not cloistered or crowned or blessed by any man's hand. She was only what she chose to be: brave. When no one expected it. Loyal. When no one required it. Still. When the whole world shouted at her to bend. And for that, she gave her life. So tonight, if you find yourself lying awake, listening to the breath of the world as it slows, let her story keep you company, not to disturb your rest, but to deepen it. Let her silence wrap around your thoughts like a shawl. Let her strength remind you that stillness is not weakness, that faith can take many forms, and sometimes the most powerful of them is a woman who says nothing, even as the ropes pull tight. You do not need to be a saint to walk the path she walked. You only need to know, in your quietest hour, what you will not surrender. The world finally spoke her name, but she never needed it to. She had already spoken for herself, and we, who came after, need only listen. Good night.